Okay, well, let's get started. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Allen, and I am the CEO of Twist Medical. We have organised this timely and topical working session with great support from the PEOF team. We are delighted that you have joined us to explore how we can foster publications on patient engagement initiatives and look forward to a lively discussion full of rich insights. And with that, I would like to hand off to my colleague, Iffy Sargent.
Thank you, Sean. Can I move to the next slide, please? So I just want to introduce today's speakers and moderators. We have Dawn Richards, who's going to give our patient perspective on patient engagement publications. We also have Laura Dormer, who is going to give our publisher's perspective. And then we have Lisa Shea, who will give the industry perspective. Next slide, please. So this is today's agenda. We'll spend a few minutes setting the scene and doing some introduction. And then we will have our three panelists give their perspectives around fostering patient engagement publications, why it's important, what are the benefits and what's the impact. And then we'll go to the crux of this session, which is really a working session where we hope to get your feedback and input around some key questions and where we go next. And then we'll wrap up with a plenary feedback on what we heard in the working sessions and also explore what the next steps will be. So a little bit about the organisers and the facilitators from Twist Medical. So Sean Allen, who gave the opening introduction and welcome, is the co-founder of Twist Medical, which was set up in 2016 as a MedComms partner. He's responsible for the overall strategic direction, growth, and management of the company. And then you have myself, Iffy Sargent. I'm the VP of Medical Strategy and Publications at Twist Medical. I've been involved in patient engagement publications for a long time, starting with co-creation of patient-reported experience measures back in around 2012 in rheumatoid arthritis and other rheumatic conditions. And I've co-authored around 20 or so peer-reviewed publications focusing on PE activity. I'm also the scientific publications lead for PFMD. We're also joined by Anne-Marie Amoir, thank you, who is the Senior Director of Patient Services at Twist Medical. She has been the lead for multi-stakeholder co-creation of patient engagement projects across all phases of medicine's development. And she's also been involved in the delivery of resources and tools for practical patient engagement implementation. This includes guidance, exemplars, and a training platform. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over to Anne-Marie, who's going to walk us through the next bit and also introduce our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Iffy. Our experience in patient engagement has convinced us of the need to robustly document and disseminate both the methodology and insights from PE efforts through rigorous peer-reviewed publications. So this ensures that the PE community can continue to learn and build on experiences and insights, prevent duplication of efforts, and ensures that diverse stakeholders groups have the compelling evidence they need to further advance patient engagement. We started by establishing an advisory board in September 2022, that's just 1 year ago, to understand the priorities for PE publication, then held a roundtable session at ISMAP Europe conference in January this year to get insights from the perspective of publication specialists. For those who are not familiar with ISMAP, ISMAP is for the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals. And today's PEOF session provides us an enormous opportunity to now gather insight, feedback, and recommendation from a diverse multi-stakeholder group of PE active participants. Before we dive into our session, some housekeeping notes. Despite being a virtual session, we ask everyone be present and engage. All microphones will be muted. Please provide your questions to our panel in the Q&A functions and comments or feedback in the chat. I just remember you that this session will be recorded. And now let's make this workshop interesting together. Before the PEOF session, we organized a survey to really understand a little bit the context here of where the participants are sitting and where they stand with PE publication. You can see that we had a diversity of stakeholder groups participating in the survey with a range of PE publication experience ranging from no involvement to being a co-author or leading PE publication efforts. So it's very diverse. Next slide. We also heard that PE publications was a high or medium priority for most of the responders, which is a good signal. And the PE publication motivators, which really driving the interest to develop PE publication, included demonstrating robustness of PE activity methodology, providing feedback to stakeholders involved, and enhancing the visibility both internal and external to the organization. We will be exploring these questions in more detail during our workshop sessions later today. And we will now hear from our panel and then have some time for a brief Q&A after the three presentations. Just to remember you to use the Q&A function to ask questions to our panelists. Okay, I would like to introduce Dawn Richard to share a patient partner's perspective on PE publication. Welcome, Dawn.
Thanks a lot, Anne-Marie, and it's really nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. As Anne-Marie indicated, I am a patient partner. I took on that title, I suppose, almost 20 years ago when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and I've been more recently during the pandemic diagnosed with osteoarthritis. I'm actually a basic scientist by training, so I'm an analytical chemist. So I kind of have my feet in both sides of the equation here, but I'll be bringing my patient partner perspective today. And I'm really pleased to see where we've come in terms of publications and patient engagement. I became involved with the Patient Focused Medicines Development Initiative, or PFMD, after a random evening email to Nicholas Brook, probably about 6 years ago, and was happy to be part of developing their patient engagement quality guidance, and was initially involved in some of the work around patients as partners in preclinical projects. So it's just really nice to continue on this journey with so many like-minded individuals. My Twitter handle is there for you who are still in the dumpster fire known as Twitter, and you can feel free to share anything you'd like from my presentation, tag me in, whatever you'd like to do there. So I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. So I think it seems like probably many of you have some experience with working with patient partners and developing these patient engagement publications. I just wanted to start off with some of the benefits from a patient perspective. I often hear researchers and others talk about how they've benefited from working with patient partners. But I thought it would be helpful just to kind of kick things off with, so what's in it for us? What do we get out of it? So one thing is that, this is probably no surprise, patient partners bring a really often different perspective from others on the team that really complements, those of you who have scientific training, medical training. The perspective tends to be a little bit more, I'll say, on the ground, a little bit more about, what it's like to live daily with a condition and how that impacts things. So the perspective is just very fresh and different, I think. Whether we like it or not, patients are often seen as biased. They're seen as objective. They're seen as clouded by the perspectives they bring of living with different conditions and their healthcare experiences. No surprise, right? That colors a lot of what we do. And I don't think it's right to say that they need to be objective, but to be honest, being part of a robust peer review process gives us credibility. It gives us credibility that we don't have otherwise. And whether we like that or not, we can have a different discussion about that. But this really helps kind of give us another notch on our belt and have people look at us differently, that we participated in these kinds of processes that other people see as objective and robust. It gives us an opportunity to contribute to the overall global science of patient engagement. I think it's really important that as we continue to publish on patient engagement, we're helping build that science, and for patient partners to see that they've contributed to that, the people who benefit the most from that, I think that's really cool and important. This gives me something positive from my diagnosis. So, I've been 20 years ago, I was handed this diagnosis. I'm probably always going to live with this disease. I'm not hopeful that rheumatoid arthritis is going to be cured in my lifetime, although we've seen amazing things happen and how people are treated and their quality of life has changed. I can eat properly till the cows come home. I can exercise. I can sleep properly. But you know what? My RA is really in control. It's going to do what it wants to do when it wants to do it. And for me, being involved in these types of activities is something really positive. It's something I get to control for a change. And to be quite frank, my whole career trajectory changed when I discovered this patient engagement world. And so that's been amazing for me. And I know it's been really beneficial for many patient partners that I've worked with and who I know. And lastly, it helps us learn. Who doesn't like to learn new things? Who doesn't like to work with new people? And just have your life enriched by new processes as well. So I'll ask to go to the next slide, please. So those are some benefits from my perspective. Those aren't totally inclusive. Those are just some of the big things. I'm going to move on and talk about a case study. And this is a project I was involved in about 4 years ago, where we developed and published guidance on authorship and acknowledgement when patient partners are on the publication team. And this idea actually came from patient partners. It didn't come from the researchers. It came from patients at a chronic pain network, which is a pan-Canadian network that is funded by our federal health funding agency here in Canada. One of the caveats of this network is that patient partners must be engaged in the network. And here, in fact, they are engaged in all areas of governance, all committees, all research projects, et cetera. So the network was getting to this maturity stage where research was starting to be published that patient partners have been part of. And patient partners said, is there something on guidance? Do we meet authorship criteria? What can we do here? So I'll talk a bit about how we did that in another slide. But overall, what we did here is we learned together as we wrote and submitted the manuscript. So this is kind of a meta example, right? We wrote a publication together about how patient partners can be authors or should be acknowledged in publications. This was fascinating. This process was quite new for many of our patient partners. When you step back and think about it, the peer review process, if you talk to your spouse or your family about this who aren't in science, it's weird. it's a really weird process, right? I submit something that might be published. A bunch of people I don't know who are experts in this area take a look at it, critique it, and then maybe I work some of those ideas into my original manuscript. It's weird, right? So for our patient partners, they were learning as they went. This was new for them. They had all kinds of questions and they contributed in all these amazing ways. And we found out as we worked on this together that patient partners can actually meet the International Committee of Journal and Medical Editors requirements for authors in different ways that those on, quote, your typical research team wouldn't necessarily look at the lens through. We've got tons of interest in this paper. So it was published in 2020. I call it the little paper that keeps giving. We keep giving webinars, we keep giving conference presentations, and the uptake is still really strong on this. And I'll show that in the next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of the publication, and I can share the link in the chat shortly. A few things about the publication. So it's been in, it was published in Research Involvement and Engagement. And when we developed and wrote the paper, we actually had an established relationship with our patient partners. So many of them we'd been working together with for about 3 or 4 years at that time. And they were part of a committee within the Chronic Pain Network that guided the patient engagement efforts of the network. So this committee developed tools and other resources, mostly for the network, but sometimes beyond. And this was one of their big resources that we developed for many people to use outside of the network. As I mentioned earlier, the idea for this originally came from patient partners. We originally just wrote guidance for the network internally on this. And we did homework. We couldn't find anything in the peer-reviewed literature about this. We couldn't find anything in the gray literature about this. We talked to people in well-known people in patient engagement or in PPI, and they all said, like, I haven't seen anything on this. So, well, it originally was guidance within the network. We decided then to turn it into an actual peer-reviewed publication. As I mentioned earlier, the dissemination and use around this is really strong still. I'll be honest, it's blown away anything from my analytical chemistry days that I've worked on. I don't know what that says about my thesis, but it's had over 10,000 accesses in a few years. It's been cited a lot of times. And we know from the altmetric score that it's still very relevant. People are sharing it on social media and beyond. And then, you know, we continue to give webinars, and I'll do that often with patient partners. And then it's led to other outputs. I'll also share in the chat a little video that I developed with a few other people about this topic. And it's got really specific information about how you would work with patients as partners in publishing. It's only 4 minutes. It's available in English and French. And we released that about a year ago, and it's got over 1,000 views as well. So next slide, please. So just to wrap things up, from my perspective, here are some key takeaways and hopefully helpful tips for those of you who are working in this area. Patient partners can meet authorship requirements, but that might look different from your other team members that you work with, and the supports that they need might be really different. When we worked on this publication, and in another publication I'm working on actually right now, you know, we've met with people over Zoom. We've had people email things to us. We've talked individually to some of our patient partners. Some of them are totally fine with Google Docs, track changes, etc. They may need more time than others on your research team, those types of things. And it's really important to work with them on those. My spidey senses always are heightened when I see academics or other people write about patient engagement and research, and they don't actually have any patient authors on their team. To me, that looks like someone's shining a microscope on something, but they're looking at it very theoretically, and they haven't actually worked with patient partners, whether that's the correct assumption or not. So if you write about this, I'd really encourage you to work with patient authors. Hopefully I've convinced you that patient partners bring a different perspective, they bring a different diversity, and they just view things really differently from the scientists, the medical perspectives that are on the team. And lastly, I just want to leave you with the fact that the patient engagement components of your work have actually contributed to the results. So please don't leave them out. Actually see your patient engagement as like part of your methodology. Your results would not be the same without engaging patient partners. And you would never leave out any other kind of methodology from a scientific paper. So I know sometimes it gets squeezed, it gets taken out because of word lengths, etc. So if you have to do that, I hate to tell you this, but I encourage you to write another paper specific about that. Please just don't leave it out. People can learn so much from it. And that's it from me. Thanks very much. I look forward to our conversations together.
Thank you, Dawn. We can move to the next slide. Okay. So I would like to introduce Laura Dormer to share her editor's perspective on patient engagement publication. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks, Anne-Marie. So yeah, as Anne-Marie just said, I'm Laura Dormer, and I'm here to talk to you today about publications on patient engagement initiatives from my perspective, both as a publisher, but perhaps more pertinently from my perspective as a journal editor who has received submissions to one of the journals that I work on of this type of publication. So next slide, please. So first of all, when I started thinking about this session, I wanted to get a bit of an idea of what the current landscape is of patient engagement publications, what that looks like. And while sadly for me, there's no one definitive publication, no one definitive number that I can give you today, I did want to talk through some of the data that I came across and that I've been reading over the however long that's available on this at the moment, that gives a bit of a snapshot. And there certainly are various studies that suggest that patient engagement publications are increasing, which is great to see. And in fact, studies have actually been looking at this topic for over a decade now, I found. So one of the first things I came across was an early study from 2012. And that found that at that point in time, there had been a year-on-year increase looking from 2002 to 2011 of publications. So in 2002, there was a meager 4 publications, and by 2011 they found 66. So even looking back quite a way, there was publications in this area, and they were on the increase. Jumping forward to a bit more recently, so last year in 2022, there was a study that was published in the journal PLOS One. And that also found a rapid increase in the number and, in some instances, the quality of randomized controlled trials investigating the effectiveness of consumer engagement, which is a posh way of saying engagement from patients. In 2023, a study in BMJ found patients to be involved in study design. In 90% of the publications that they found that patients were involved in study conduct in 71% of cases, and they were also involved in the dissemination of research in 42% of cases, which is really encouraging to see. And in a recent study on patient engagement in real-world studies, this particular publication identified 49 records that involved patients in real-world evidence studies, and 34 of which, so a massive proportion, were published from 2020 onwards. So this is something that is on the increase, and it's on the more rapid increase in the last 3 to 4 years. Finally, I did a very quick and unscientific study of my own, just by having a quick search on PubMed, which, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a website that indexes journal articles in the medical area. So I had a quick search on there using the search term patient engagement, just to give a very, very broad snapshot. And as you can see from the graph on the right-hand side of this screen, publications mentioning this have been growing every year, and particularly steeply since 2019. Next slide, please. Thank you. I also wanted to take a look more broadly at patients acting as authors on publications, as I think you can kind of take this as a bit of a proxy of the amount of patient engagement that is going on when patients are actually involved as authors on the publications that are coming out. And again, this is a number very encouragingly that is increasing. So I've taken a couple of sources here. The first is a presentation, a poster that was presented at this year's ISMAP annual meeting and was authored by Karen Woolley and colleagues. I think I saw Karen was one of our attendees, so I'm glad I've name checked her. And in their publication, they took a look at the change in the number of publications that featured patient authors and found a massive increase, as you can see on the table on the left-hand side there. And also a massive increase in the annual publication rate of papers with patient authors, which is really encouraging to see. Also a publication that I was involved in myself a little while ago now, we looked at the number of patient authors as part of that publication that had published in the journal Research, Involvement and Engagement, and found that a relatively small number of papers were published in 2015 in that journal, and that had grown quite considerably by 2020 to 34 out of 69 research articles published in that journal. I should say that is a journal that very strongly encourages patient involvement and actually has a patient advocate as one of their editors-in-chief. So it's a great example. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just quickly on some goals for the future, the publications that I came across here highlighted some areas that I think could be something to focus on going forward. First, a very recent study from this year in the BMJ called for more specific guidance for research on how to report their patient involvement activities. Just going back to what Dawn mentioned at the end of her slides, we wouldn't leave out any other types of methodology. So it's important that this is reported effectively in publications that involve patients. And this particular study found that only 40% of the publications they looked at, so 34 out of 86, reported what the aim was of the patient involvement, which seems quite a miss. And they often were unspecific in reporting what influence patients' input had. It was quite vague, they found. So again, this is something that can be improved, I think, going forward. I think as well, it's important that we make patients' involvement easy to identify. So improving how we can discover which papers involve patients, and particularly as authors, would be something that's something that could be quite easily improved, but would make it a lot easier for us to benchmark and track changes over time. And finally, another recent study that was also presented at the ISMAP 2023 conference suggested that perhaps there's a bit of a lack of diversity in patients that are being engaged in this kind of work. And they found that patient authors were more likely to be women, and they're also more likely to be from high-income countries. So going forward, I think it will be something to look at to make sure that that diversity is something that's considered. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I just wanted to talk about a quick case study of a paper that I was involved in as an editor that was submitted to the journal that I work on, which is a health economics and outcomes research journal. So quite a sort of a technical niche journal. And this particular paper was a methodology paper that was describing the development of a new method for engaging patients in the valuation of healthcare by using patient goals. The study included various steps, which included forming and getting input from a steering committee, and that steering committee was formed with patients, with clinicians, researchers, practitioners, and they developed a survey, and they also conducted interviews with patients. They collected that survey data, and then the steering committee came back at the end and reviewed it to determine the feasibility of using it in a process called health technology assessment, which is how new drugs and treatments and things are approved for use. This particular study was looking in the field of rheumatoid arthritis. And they concluded in the study that they did have the evidence that this is a method that could work more broadly and in wider circumstances. So being involved in this publication was quite an interesting experience for me. And I just wanted to share some top tips that I gathered whilst working on it. So next slide, please. So first of all, this was a paper that came into me via a pre-submission inquiry. So as a journal editor, I always appreciate when people get in touch with me prior to the sort of the full submission of their papers, just to talk about it, to discuss if the topic is something that the journal would consider. They inquired whether patient authors were permitted in my journal. This paper did have patient authors involved. They asked me questions about timelines, all those sorts of things. And I would really encourage doing that to get an idea from the journal that you're planning to submit to, whether they would welcome your submission. Luckily, patient authors was something that I've been involved in over the last few years, not least through my involvement with PFMD. So something I was very, very keen to encourage in the journal that I was working on. Something else I look at as a journal editor, and again, and calling back on what Dawn said, it's nice when the author group is representative of the study that has taken place. And if this paper had come into me and hadn't got any patients, at least in the contributor section, if not, the actual authorship, then that would have been ringing sort of alarm bells to me that perhaps it wasn't as representative as it could have been. Something this paper included as well was a plain language summary. So that's another thing that I'm quite passionate about, articles including a plain language summary abstract. And actually this paper came in without that initially, and that was something that we worked on with the authors to develop during the revision process. So I would really recommend the inclusion of that as well. Something that's very useful for journal editors as well is the recommendation of suitable peer reviewers for an article, and lots of journals encourage these kind of suggestions. And I think in research that perhaps a journal is less familiar in dealing with, like patient engagement studies, this could be really helpful for the journals to move it through quickly. And also my final top tip really, when you're thinking particularly about which journal you might want to submit to, is think about how that content is shared. Do they have, is it an open access journal? Do they have an open access option? Do they have a strong social media presence? Because as we know, that's a place where a lot of people discover content. And I think I'm just about at time, so I will wrap it up there. But I really look forward to talking about this further in the breakout sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So just to remember, if you have any question, it's time now to ask question to our speakers. So we come to the last speaker. I would like to introduce Lisa Shea to share a pharma industry perspective on PE publication. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Really happy to be here and amongst this panel. Really great insights so far. So I'm happy to be presenting the industry perspective. So I'm Lisa Shea. I'm the scientific patient engagement lead at Johnson & Johnson. I've been working in this space for about 3+ years. And at J&J, we've built a number of capabilities to systematically engage patients in research all throughout the development lifecycle. I mainly sit in the post-marketing medical affairs space right now, so post-commercialization, and we've developed a method to obtain insights from patients over time, continuously, and really partner with patients so that they're truly informing our thinking and our research at J&J. So excited to be talking with you about that framework and how we've grown that to enable publications as well. So next slide, please. So the first piece here is why publish patient insights. So we know that the regulatory environment and industry guidance really stands behind this. With the patient-focused drug development guidance document, we know that the FDA stands behind the aim to more systematically obtain patient perspective to help inform decision-making. And they recognize the importance of patient experience data. And this has really guided J&J's efforts to create and establish processes to engage with patients more regularly and systematically. The 2022 good publication practice guidelines that really talk about publications should be conducted for part of scientific exchange. And they talk about in this guidance document that patient experience and how patients experience their disease and their healthcare is and should be an important part of scientific exchange. They also talk a bit around patients as authors in this as well, which speaks to some of the points that Dawn and Laura have made. And then we also recognize that patients have unique expertise in their disease area. The stories and experiences they provide can really help add a layer of context to the data. And what we found is that patient experience data is really limited, particularly when it comes to industry-driven research. So we felt that we could fill this gap through publishing our established patient engagement activities that are largely qualitative in nature, to really help broaden access to understanding what patients are going through, and elevate this to the broader healthcare community. We feel there's a place for both a robust statistical analysis of a large data set and a patient quote to really help tell an impactful story and inform patient-centered care. Next slide, please. So some practical considerations to publish on patient engagement research. So as I mentioned, we do have an existing framework for engaging patients to generate patient insights, largely qualitative in nature through focus groups and interviews, but we do surveys and have quantitative methods as well. All of our research starts with having a legitimate interest to help patients in the disease areas that we're working on. And with that, we've been able to make sure that we have transparency with our patients. So patients need to understand how we anticipate using the data we generate. And it's really our responsibility to ensure this transparency with patients. So we have contracts in place around that highlight how the insights will be used, which includes now publications, as well as ensure protections around PII and sensitive health information too. Which leads me to my third point on that slide, to ensure close partnership with our legal, healthcare compliance, regulatory, and privacy partners to build a framework, build those contracts to make sure that we are pulling through transparency and pulling through governance at the same time. So relying on those internal SOPs and guardrails is also really important. We did quite a bit of legwork to understand our internal publications SOP, ICMJE guidelines, and then to create and apply these concepts to publishing our patient engagement research at J&J. Also spent some time with other researchers in medical and scientific affairs who currently publish their work to see what we can learn from them and also apply that in our space. Through this process, we've been able to identify internal champions and leaders to help build use cases and publications. So it all started with our first publication in psoriatic arthritis in 2021, and then being able to take that use case, share it out in the organization to inspire and motivate others to do the same. We've also been able to build on our guardrails that we established through just a kind of a test and learn approach. And then lastly, it's around journal selection. And I think Laura really spoke to this nicely in that we need to, when we think about selecting journals, we need to think about open access. So can patients access the journal to allow them to access the information, share that information with providers? Also really important to look at journals that are interested in publishing patient perspectives and have a history of publishing qualitative data. So some of the qualitative data research methods I think are new. And when journals have experience with that, the peer review process also could go more efficiently as well. And then lastly is the patient co-author piece, which we're hearing from both Dawn and Laura, and how important that is, looking for those journals to, again, help make sure that we're amplifying the patient voice. Next slide, please. So benefits and impact, trust and partnership, engaging patients in research throughout the research process, which includes publications, really helps to strengthen the network of the patient communities we aim to serve and build that partnership and trust. Patients have shared with us that they feel a sense of pride that their experience matters when we work with them. They have a sense of altruism, that they really want to help others dealing with the same disease. And that's feedback we've gotten directly from patients. And I think Dawn also spoke a bit about that as well. We also feel that industry has an opportunity to support patients to help the larger scientific community understand what those patient needs are by publishing, by involving patients throughout the research process to ensure that what we study and the materials we generate are really relevant to the patient needs. And by publishing on our patient engagement research, we help to give patients a larger share of voice in the healthcare conversation so that the broader healthcare community can consider these perspectives in the decision-making process. And importantly, through the work that we've done to publish, we've really helped strengthen our research methodology to ensure that how we collect the data and how we analyze it is acceptable for scientific publication. So enhancing the rigor in our research has really been a great benefit and impactful, I would say, to our qualitative research capabilities within J&J. And then lastly, publishing patient insights really underscores our commitment to patient engagement by putting the patient experience in the public domain. It helps enhance our reach of our findings. We can reach more healthcare providers, more patients, more decision makers to really put the patient at the center. And this in turn helps Johnson & Johnson be seen as a thought leader in this space and help support patient communities more broadly. So the next slide, excuse me, I will share a quick case study with you all. It's actually a poster presentation that we worked on with researchers in medical affairs to understand patient and caregiver unmet needs in a rare disease space. So for those who aren't familiar, myasthenia gravis is a rare chronic autoimmune disease that's marked by muscular weakness. And given J&J's investment in this space, we pulled together one of our long-term focus group panels that included people with myasthenia gravis and lots of diversity around age, gender, race, ethnicity, and geography in the United States, and also included caregivers as well as part of this focus group discussion. We identified many unmet needs, which was really around increased access to specialist care, so that we could have faster diagnosis. And so you'll see that first quote there around the patient journey, that they had 5 years and their symptoms grew worse, and the doctors would tell them things like, there's nothing wrong with you. And then finally, a neurologist sat down with a book of rare disease and went through and checked off the symptoms. And that's when they were able to identify the right diagnostic test. And eventually this patient was diagnosed with myasthenia. And the other unmet need that we found was ensuring that we could, more effective treatments were needed to reduce the disease burden. So that second quote there, going to the hospitals, it's so draining. All you need is rest and medication, speaks to sort of the simplicity that the patients are really looking for when it comes to treatments, and without making the care more complicated. And then finally, because we were able to present this at the Muscular Dystrophy Association conference, we can think about the reach that we had with these patient perspectives. So from the conference, we know that there were almost 1,500 in-person attendees from 18 different countries. There were 560 plus live stream virtual attendees, and then also 14 patient advocacy groups. So again, really thinking about how we were able to amplify these patient perspectives to put the patient at the center. And then my final slide is just some quick top tips for you all, especially working with industry. I don't think these are going to surprise anybody, but making sure, again, we're partnering relentlessly with our legal, healthcare compliance, privacy, and regulatory partners to develop capabilities to engage patients, both in research processes and also publications. Leveraging existing SOPs to build processes specific to patient engagement. This was really important, and I think we're in a bit of a nuanced space. So taking the time to work with partners to identify what's in place now and how to apply that to patient engagement research and publishing that research is really, really critical. And then the last piece, of course, in terms of making sure that we build relationships with patients and patient communities, is ensuring consent and transparency in everything we do. Patients and caregivers need to be aware of why we're doing what we're doing and then how we plan on using that information at the end of the day. So with that, I will close it out, and I look forward to speaking with you in the breakout sessions. Thanks so much for the time and attention today.
Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, Lisa. So I see that there is a question in the Q&A. Lisa, if you have a chance to answer Karen's question in the Q&A, that would be amazing. So now we're going to go into the working session into 3 breakout groups. Group 1 will be led by Dawn. Group 2 will be led by Laura, and Group 3 will be led by Lisa. So really, the objectives of the breakout workshops we're about to go into is to validate some of our survey findings that we did ahead of this session, especially around the limitations and motivators for developing peer-reviewed publications of patient engagement activities. Our second objective is to really identify what we need as a PE community to support systematic development of patient engagement publications. We've heard from our panelists the benefit and the impact, so we want to know how we can support this and what we need to do to make sure it happens. So a few instructions for the breakout rooms. So you're going to be automatically split into 3 rooms. You don't need to do anything. We'll have 30 minutes together. If you've got questions, you can use the chat box in Zoom, or let's make it really interactive. Raise your hand and we'll call on you so we can have a really good discussion. But do wait for your name to be called before you intervene. We appreciate that we can't answer all the questions live, so we will try to connect you with the speakers so that you can continue the conversation.
Welcome to breakout room 1. So if you just went over this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically we're going to kind of put you through the same survey that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, just to see how, you know, your responses kind of stack up against that, and to help warm you up for the real heart of what we want to do with you, which is have a good conversation about identifying what supports might really be helpful in your and others' work of patient engagement in publication. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to use Slido. Hopefully people are familiar with Slido to get you engaged. You can either just hold your phone up to the QR code, or in your browser, you can go to slido.com and enter in the number. We're going to ask you to anonymously identify how you would classify the group that you represent in the session right now. And we'll see how that stacks up against what the results were from the original 51 responses that we had just prior to the webinar. So I think the results are going to come up as you go ahead and input your responses. So we've got 5 of you have responded so far. I know we've got 22 people in the group, and I know a number of us probably are not going to respond, being the folks who are leading things and being in the background here. But maybe a couple more of you can respond. We're up to 11. Okay, awesome. So from the original survey that was given pre-webinar, we had about 35% of people from industry. Next, just like we're reflecting here, we had 31% of you identified as some type of patient, caregiver, etc. So those were kind of the top 2 from the survey. And then we had, in the original survey, we had folks from agencies, researchers, and CRO is at the bottom. So it doesn't look like we've got any healthcare professionals or a few others, medical technology company or other industry. Yeah, I think for those of you who are wearing multiple hats, I hear you. It's a challenge to slice and dice yourself, right? No problem. Okay, so that was kind of our first question to get you warmed up. So it's just helpful for us to know who we're talking to and understand that some of you might identify as a number of those. So let's go to the next slide, which is our next question. Okay, so our next question for you is again another Slido. So if you'll remember in the preliminary survey, we heard that the key motivators for developing patient engagement publications included 4 things. They were demonstrating the robustness of the patient engagement methodology, providing accessible and citable documentation, a mechanism for feedback to stakeholders, and increasing visibility of your patient engagement initiatives. So do you agree with this? We'll have a bit of time for you to elaborate on things if you think that, there's something beyond those 4 themes that you would like reflected. But for now, let's just respond to the Slido. And I think your options are agree, don't agree, and maybe don't know, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So let's see what you're thinking. Are you aligned with what the survey indicates? Okay, we've already hit almost all the respondents. So most of you agree with that. And a few of you are not completely sure. And none of you disagree. Okay, that's good for us to know. So let's go on to the next slide. And I think this is where we can open things up for a bit of a chat. If there are any things that you feel aren't captured within those motivators that you might like to speak to. So are there any other motivators that you feel weren't captured by the responses to the survey? Some of you weren't entirely sure. You can go ahead and type them into the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can bring you off mute and have you respond. Any thoughts about other things you've seen in your own experiences that aren't captured by those 4 kinds of buckets of things? Yeah, maybe we can go back. I think it's going to be to the previous slide, and the motivators are listed. No, to the previous slide. Yeah, the second slide. Oh, yeah. So those are the 4 motivators that came through in the survey. Does anyone have any other things that they would like to suggest? It seemed like most people were in agreement, but if there's any that you feel are kind of outside those 4 buckets. Steve, I see your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself, or do I have to do that for you? You can. Okay, go for it, Steve.
They've foolishly given me the power, so I will take full control of that. One thing I think that we don't reflect on very well is actually the questions that want to be answered by the community. So often it's not the patient who are the drivers of the question. And so I think one thing that it's not just giving feedback to stakeholders, it's actually taking ownership of the questions and driving that as well. I think that's one thing that we miss and can do an awful lot better. And
Steve, can I ask the perspective that you're bringing?
In what way? So help me understand what you mean by the perspective.
Are you a patient partner? Are you from industry?
All of the above. So that multiple hats, but in this regard, it's so as someone who actively is involved in research and driving research questions with partnership of both clinical and academic research, it's a challenge to have them to actually see value of the question that the community might want to address. So that motivator, I think, is sometimes missed, and the communities are not always, because it's seen as we're very happy to be here. There's this gratefulness.
Yeah.
And the gratefulness doesn't always allow people to stick their elbows out and go, we should be here, and this is what we want from this research question to address.
Yep, I hear you. Excellent point, Steve. Thanks a lot for that. Any other comments related to what Steve has just said? I see, Sheila, you've said a question should be developed by patient advocates or patient communities, etc. Barry, I see your hand up. Would you like to go for it?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that these are all great motivators, but in a way I look at it, I'm like, are they all the same in the sense of depending upon the situation, wouldn't you kind of prioritize them, possibly? Because when I look at them, what I'm immediately drawn to is the citability. I feel like there's so much doubt around this kind of data, whether it's coming from regulators, HTA bodies, academics, and even fellows in industry. But by getting it into a peer-reviewed, citable paper, I mean, that's the gold standard, that
Sure.
people will understand it, and therefore it's got the power that it needs. And I'm totally behind Steve when he says, like, the patient community needs to drive this. And I regularly work in small groups, and that's exactly how we approach it. Like, work with patients to understand, like, what is the need? What do they care about? It's different from their perspective. And then we work together to actually drive that research forward. But throughout that process, they are actually guiding us. We provide the knowledge, how to do it, methodologically, how you analyze it, but ultimately they drive what is the question and then the interpretation of the results. Because I think that's also super important, because when I look at something, when a KOL looks at something, we come in with a certain perspective. But when a patient looks at it, they look at it like, wow, I was in a situation where they looked at the background information, literally the noise in the background, and said, wow, look at that. I'm like, there's nothing there. And they're like, exactly. That's what we always thought was going to be there, but you've actually proven it. And so even when it's not exactly what you think, patients will come in and tell you where the true gold sits.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Barry. And Barry, can you just let people know, are you from industry or what's your
I'm actually at
here?
an agency, but I work with pharmaceutical companies and patient groups.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
And I thanks, John. John has shared an example of patient-driven research questions from an academic research network here in Canada. So thanks for that. Okay, I think those are all excellent points. So you can continue to type things in the chat, but I think we're going to keep moving on because we do really want to spend some good time with you chatting about, what might be some of the solutions to some of the limitations that we've heard of through the survey. So I think let's go to the slide just beyond this one, which I think is another Slido, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And so in the preliminary survey, we heard that the key limitations to developing patient engagement publications were lack of internal resources within organizations and clear guidance on how to proceed with developing these patient engagement publications. So we're going to do another one of these. Do you agree? Yes, no, don't know. And then we're going to go into a discussion around this, as well as some of the potential solutions that you think might help overcome some of these limitations. So get your Slido hands together and let's see what you've got to tell us about whether you agree with this or not. And it looks like most people are either looks like people haven't responded yet. So we'll give you a minute here. Okay, so we're getting some responses. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to the folks in the background who are rapidly going between Slido, showing us what the results are. I know that could be frantic, so thank you for that. Okay, so some people are agreeing with those kind of big limitations that were highlighted from the survey. Some of you aren't sure, and we've got a few no's as well. So we'll just give everyone another moment or two if you've got strong thoughts on that before we move into more discussion around that. Okay, so I think let's move into continued discussion. I just want to let people know We've got about till 50 past the hour or 10 to the hour, wherever you are located, to continue in our breakout groups. So we've got quite a bit of time to have a discussion around this. So can we go on to the next slide that will help us with our discussion, please? Awesome. Okay, so I'd be curious if the individuals who responded no on that last slide out, if they're willing to share their insights with us. And then we're going to have a discussion again. Feel free to put things in the chat or raise your hand and we'll have a discussion about what you feel would be helpful to better support you in this work. So Laura, I see your hand up. Would you like to go for it?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, and just for context, I'm from a patient organisation in the UK. So I think I put don't know, just to clear. I wasn't one of the no's because I think there's something around there's guidance coming out. There's kind of more and more guidance out there around kind of publications and things like that. But maybe there's a question around people being aware of the guidance and where to find it. But I also think something around messaging. I think you mentioned in your presentation, we know word limits and, you know, all these things, people squeeze and cut things out. But if there's a concerted message from multiple stakeholders about the importance maybe of including these things in, so if that's from the journals, if that's from the patient organizations and funders, just that message almost to build momentum would be something that, I mean, I don't know, but it is an idea or something to consider maybe.
I think that's totally fair, Laura. So one is there are some things that exist. Do people actually know about them, right? So how do we help increase awareness on some of those things? And then secondly, journals somehow signaling that this is actually important for people to be describing, whether it's in their methodology, throughout their paper. And I think we see a little bit of that with some journals right now, right? And there's if you're familiar with the GRIP2 tool that some journals need to have filled out when you submit your manuscript. But I find sometimes the GRIP2 tool can be a little bit constricting, to be honest with you. So Sheila, I see your hand up. Thank you, Laura. That was great.
Hi. So I'm an independent patient advocate right now, and I've done a couple of patient reviews of papers and abstracts, etc. I've also collaborated with a number of pharma companies, and I've co-authored. What I've noticed is that, yes, funding is a big issue. And basically, the pharma company already knows who they want to collaborate with, because the patient advocate is perhaps quote unquote useful to them because of their because they are well known and because they have a good return on interest for the company. My main concern, I was at WAPO before, it was always the issue of language. So this is also the comment that I put in the Q&A at the beginning. Everything is done in English, that's fine. But when it comes then to convert these things into other languages, yes, there's DeepL, yes, there is ChatGPT, etc., etc. But if you want to do it professionally, you need to find funding to have it translated properly and have it checked by the medical advisory board that a patient group may have. Sometimes patient groups get funding for this, sometimes they don't. How do we make sure that the patient community not only has access to it, but it is in the language that they speak and eat and sleep with? That's my big issue.
Thanks, Sheila. So I heard a couple of things there. You talk about funding, but you know, part of it is not so much the funding for, you know, industry to be doing this. They have somewhat deep pockets, especially compared to patient organizations who at the end of the day are often run by volunteers and have this burden put on them of, well, great, we did this work, it's all in English. If you need to translate it, you're kind of on your own, right? So, and I'm being very facetious there, but that's a bit of the message there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yep.
I think maybe I can bring some of the perspective of something that we learn in doing the first check with the industry. What we have seen also is that the patient engagement groups have a lot of time, a lot of difficulties to find the budget to really bring publication, PE publication live. I think there is a need to really connect much better with the scientific writers, whatever it's medical affairs or other departments who are leading that, to really have, any companies have a strategic annual publication plan. And it's really to see how patient engagement publication can really enter in this strategic publication plan, because then you have funding, to really agree to say 1 or 2 publication will be patient engagement publications in your strategic annual publication plan. And it's the way to avoid that the PE officers are all the time struggling to get access to a budget and to do it a little bit out of scope and then get discouraged about this. That's something we heard when we were asking, I will not say the big pharma, because the big pharma, they have now that embedded in their process, but it's much more like small company, but still have investment in patient engagement work, but are struggling to really move the work or the initiatives to the publication phase.
Thanks for adding that context, Anne-Marie. I appreciate that. Steve, I see a comment from you about identification of the right partners from both sides. Are you able to join us and just explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I think some of the success is driven by actually having partners from both sides who actually understand what would be the requirements for involving patient voice and accepting those, and also on the patient community voice, having a comprehension, what will it look like, what could success look like for this publication for us. So it is not a given that because we write this paper that it will be published. And so there's an expectation management, and some of that is not thought about in advance. So I think there needs to be clear conversation in regards to those rule of engagement of what does it look like for us both partnering together, and both sides have to really understand what that means. And we talk about the capacity, even a short 1,500 word common paper with 4 different research partners, be they patients, be they academics, be they industry. If we just track the amount of email traffic that will come from something like that on top, is it aligned with, 1, do we have the capacity, and 2, is it aligned with the strategy that the organization wants to actually bring? So I think there's a lot more thought that needs to go on around, would you like to write a paper with us, and really understanding what that might mean.
Yep. Okay. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Steve, your comment in the chat is kind of aligned with that as well, right? And the terminology and the language that's used related to publications, peer review, etc.
Yeah, I mean, ask anyone, there's that lovely quote that is from an anonymous patient where they say, engagement to me, I don't want to engage with a pharmacy, I don't want to engage with my HP, my healthcare professional. I want to engage with the person who asked me to marry them. Yeah, that's what engagement is for me. So the lexicon of what has been used has not been driven by the community, and yet that comes into the peer review. So I've had, let's say, interesting, challenging, and not always rewarding conversation around what should be the lexicon. So if it is peer review and it is anything that might have a clinical aspect, then the clinical aspect is the required language, and trying to make sure that actually sometimes the language that the community would be using around how they feel comfortable can sometimes be a real challenge. And so although a patient will be involved, there's still a huge power dynamic there. And lexicon is one of those things that is a slow moving. So often in that regard, if I've had to write something that's peer reviewed, there will be a white paper or something on the back side of that, or a lay person, and there you would make the comment as to why that language was used. So for the community to understand that the reviewers, this is not in the domain, etc. So I think there's ways that we can help this sometimes for a community to say, this doesn't represent us. This language doesn't represent us. It is not how we see ourselves. So you have to explain essentially why that is, because trying to beat the battle of changing the lexicon in a peer review is a bigger ask in that regard.
Yeah.
That's a slowly moving iceberg, let's say.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Steve. I appreciate that. And Lynn, I see a comment from you in the chat about we've been working together with a couple of scientific societies and together approaching these issues about publications. It seems to work. The essence is collaboration, working towards the same goals. Would you like to come off mute and share anything else about that, Lynn?
Hang on, yes. I'm sorry, I'm not very well at the moment, so I'm not really at my best. But just to say what we've actually done the past couple of years, we've been working with a couple of the scientific societies like the European Association of Urology, and started producing material jointly. And because they're quite heavyweight and we're not, we're a little bit like David and Goliath, but we work very closely together, and it seems to be paying off. And if we then look at the role of industry in that, they seem to like this kind of formula.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Lynn. I appreciate it, given that you're not feeling great, that you shared. Thank you. Okay. I'm just taking some notes here. And Sheila, you've added another zinger about health literacy. Yes, and that can be really different amongst different countries and cultures, right? And patients often not feeling comfortable asking questions or clarifications about their treatment. Anything you'd like to add to that, Sheila? Feel free to.
Well, I live in Italy, as many of you may know, and health literacy, there's only been 2 studies done that I found. And the health literacy it's getting better because of Eupati and other doctors collaborating, but 24% of the population in Italy is senior citizens, and they don't ask questions to the doctor, period. Doctor says jump, they jump. Doctor says take it 3 times a day, they don't ask why. Take it in the morning, okay, doctor, they don't ask why. So they don't understand how the medicine can have a different effect if you take it in the afternoon or something. And if you ever read those information leaflets, it's like a blanket. And I've read many of them, and they try to use simple language, but sometimes it's just too much.
Okay.
So
Sheila.
yeah.
So we've got a few minutes left together. Are there any other kind of solutions that you think that could support some of the things we've been talking about, and that would really help for these different groups to be working together? It's okay if we've expended our energy here. Laura, I'm seeing another comment you've got there. Another consideration we have is if the PE methodology, learning and impacts will be shared in additional ways to a publication. We're conscious that if it's solely an academic publication, a lot of people who may be interested will not necessarily see it. And so when I read that, it seems like a bit of who is our audience, and are we trying to actually meet all of our audiences, right? And so are we using things maybe like social media, like video, I don't know, other things that might help to support what we're up to. So part of it is the publication itself, and then part of it is helping, I think, the appropriate people access the messages that are in publications, right?
Oh, and if I may, just one other one that I've had good success with previously has been not just sharing best practices, but the pitfalls as well, the sort of things to watch out for. So, you know, we tend to share our best practices as pat on the back.
Yeah.
But actually, for organizations who are just getting into this or dipping their toe, or the ones who've gone through it and have been, let's say, felt that it's too much of a lift for them going forward, I think there's a real need to, it's not a checklist, but it's a reality check of really, you know, outlining what does the timeline, what does the process look like? And you've done some of that in your paper, but I think it needs to be almost a check guide for the organizations. And, you know, PFMD and other organizations like that are doing this. We just need to share it more routinely. And maybe when we're asking the community of PFMD, when they're publishing, to recognize any of these resources in the publications as well. So this was possible because, and in the acknowledgements or other areas, I think that would help also, so that when we're sharing, we were able to do this because of the capacity building. So demonstrating where you got the skills.
Awesome. That's a great suggestion, Steve. Thanks.
Welcome.
And Barry, I see your hand up. I'm gonna say you're gonna be the last comment unless people put other things in the chat.
Yeah, no, I was gonna like reiterate kind of what Steve was saying is, I mean, one, I didn't even know that there were patient experience journals until a couple of years ago. I'm a scientist by training. I had no clue, and then just somehow stumbled into this and realized that there was like a whole like vista of patient experience journals that were peer reviewed, rigorous. And it's like, wow. So one, people don't even know these exist. You know, I think two, a lot of people who are sitting on the data and potentially even the evidence, they don't know the process. All of the patient engagement leads I work with in industry have no idea how to publish something, like zero.
Okay.
And I think, you know, where Steve was saying about just a very practical lexicon guide, like what is a publication? How do you proceed? You know, what are good publication processes? All of the things that, you know, as a scientist or as a medical writer, you've learned these things through years.
Yeah.
But patient engagement people don't know this, who are sitting on that side of the table, but also most patient organizations that I work with also don't know. They don't realize the trove of information they're sitting on that needs to get out. It just needs to follow a certain process, and they can do it.
Yeah. Excellent points. Thanks, Barry.
So the objectives, as Iffy just described, are really to take a look at the survey that was conducted before this session to try and get a sense of whether those kind of reflect our feelings in this group, and also to have a think about what we need to support the development of these types of patient engagement publications going forward. So it'd be really great to get as much input from you all as we can. So don't be shy, but also I think feel free to type things in the chat if you're a bit nervous of speaking on screen. That's absolutely fine as well. So to kick things off, and if we could move to the next slide, we have a polling question. So you can see on this slide here we have a QR code. If you scan that, I think with your phone, you can access the poll. I think as well you can also, oh yes, Diana has just shared the link. If you click on the link that she's just popped into the chat, you can answer the questions in your browser. And the first question is about who you are. What would you consider to be your stakeholder group? So Are you from a pharmaceutical company or industry, so medical devices? Are you a patient advocate? Are you a medical communications professional? Are you a representative of a patient organisation? Healthcare professional? I can't see the rest of the bottom of that slide, but I think that's the gist. So if you click on what you have, we can start to have to see how this this represents compared to the survey we conducted. So we'll just let that run for a little while so that we can tally all of your stakeholder groups. Interestingly, in the survey that we conducted prior to this session, about a third of those survey participants were from industry, about another third patients. I think we had 12% researchers and funders, 12% medcoms and agency folk, and the rest were made up of healthcare professionals, people with multiple stakeholder groups, and CROs, contract research organisations. So that seems to have stopped moving around. So I think if we can close the poll there. I don't know if we get a results slide. Oh, okay, so there we go. So I think, yeah, again, we've got quite a large proportion of folk from industry, but also a nice group of patients with us in the room as well. So we heard that some of the key motivators for developing patient engagement publications included demonstrating how robust that PE methodology was, providing accessible and citable documentation, and giving feedback to stakeholders, and increasing visibility of that work. So do you agree? So this is looking very good already. I'm seeing 100% agreement in the survey. I guess we can keep this quite brief. We've got a don't know, a few don't knows now coming through. I think we might get some more insight into this slide as we come on to one of the future ones that will look at how many of you have been involved in these types of publications, because I think if you haven't had any involvement in them as yet, you might not be as clear of what the motivations might be for these sorts of publications, which is good. We want to make sure we're getting a nice diversity of thoughts on this. So I think if we leave that, give it another second, but we'll leave that there for now. So we've got about 2/3 of our folks that do agree with those motivators, but we do have a few don't knows as well. So we will see when we have a chance to chat in a little minute some of the reasons behind that. And then I think if we move on then to the next slide. Okay, so this I think is the real sort of key question. Sorry, I didn't think we had a question about whether you have been involved in these publications, but I may have misconstrued that. So we can talk about that in the chat as well. But you can use the chat function. You can also raise your hand. I think I can see that, although I can't at the moment. Just having a quick look at what people have popped into the chat here so far. Yes, we've got a few points here around people representing multiple stakeholder groups. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Lots of us, we wear lots of different hats, and I think it can be difficult sometimes to shoehorn yourself into just one group. So in this section, we wanted to discuss your thoughts about the motivators around these. What are the sort of the driving influences for publishing articles and in scientific journals about patient engagement activities? What are some of the things that people think? And I think perhaps if we stop slide sharing, I'll be able to see if anybody has been brave enough to raise their hand. Oh, not so far, not so far. I think, I knew I could rely on you, Trishna. Do you want to go ahead? What do you think of some of the motivators? It's nice to see you.
So I think for me, the main motivator is to be able to demonstrate the value of patient engagement. Because I think so many of, I mean, I recognize so many of the names in the room, and I think a lot of us will probably be familiar with constantly having to justify why patient engagement is of value. And often, and we're talking about, we're in the life sciences industry, things always have to be evidence-based, and people often, well, where's the evidence? And so for me, that's the main motivator. If we've got the evidence and we do the research, then we'll be able to demonstrate tangibly the value of patient engagement, which will then hopefully encourage the people who may be sitting on the fence still around patient engagement to be able to take that step forward and say, actually, no, this is something that we should also be doing. And I completely agree with what Dawn was saying in her presentation, that if we're going to have research and publications around patient engagement, then there should always be patient authors involved, because if you're working with patients, then they will be meeting the ICMJ, can never remember the word, the order of the letter criteria, and you wouldn't leave other authors off. So that, you know, it should be the same with patient stakeholders as well. So that for me is the main motivator. I don't know what other people in the room think.
So I think, absolutely agree. I think what was quite encouraging for me was to see in those slides I presented at the beginning that there has been an increase in these types of publications, but you know, we're still talking reasonably small numbers compared to the vast number of publications and clinical trials and publications about medical research that are published every year. The proportion of those that are talking about patient engagement is still, you know, quite a small percentage.
What was interesting in the PubMed, I know obviously it wasn't scientific, but
no,
the PubMed thing, there was a dip and then it went back up, and that, when I looked at that, I thought, oh, can I see the dates? And it was so that happened to be when COVID, during the pandemic, and we actually know that patient engagement during the pandemic fell. And so I thought it was interesting that seemed to be reflected in the publications around patient engagement as well, which the pandemic has a lot of things to answer for. But I thought that was interesting that there was that noticeable dip.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a comment in the chat as well from Baber, so thank you for that, who's commented that she doesn't really know of anyone from her patient community, and she comes from a smaller country and from a rare disease area. She's not aware of anyone who'd be willing to do these sorts of publications outside of the formal education process. I don't know, Baber, if you can elaborate more on that in the chat, and why you think that might be. Is it for sort of privacy reasons? Because I know that can be perhaps a concern for patients, you know, to act as authors. Obviously, you're putting yourself out there, you're making it sort of publicly known, what is, you know, a very private thing, which is your own personal health. Baber, hello, thanks for coming on.
Sorry, it's more about the thing that not all people are like related to science, and publications as such is something very specific. For example, the education system in Latvia started requiring having publications only, I don't know, a decade or maybe, because when I was studying 20 years ago, there was no request to do scientific publications. And it's only now when in the formal education process, there is some. And therefore, in the patient organizations, as I understand, people would like, there are approximately a half of organizations which are actually reading and doing scientific, all these new things. But because we are in such a small country, Latvia is less than 2 million people, that means that we can't do like the big science. We can only participate. Clinical trials are not very popular here. It's only in few cases, and we are only participants there. We are not like driving the agenda for having clinical trials. And that's why I gave comment like this, that I don't think that people even know everything of this exists.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I take that point. I think, you know, it can be hard enough to even know these clinical trials are taking place, to have an opportunity to be on the clinical trial as a patient. The last thing you're thinking about is, oh, I might do a publication on this, or, you know, it's not even, you know, on a lot of people's radar. So yeah, absolutely, that's a very good point. We've got another hand raised, Francisca. I don't know if you wanted to speak.
Sure, thank you. I don't know whether you can see me. I think the camera is not working. Sorry about that.
We can hear you fine though, that's the main thing.
I think it's important to have patients or patient representatives being part as author of publications, because they contribute to some extent also to the generation of the data. So if they contribute to the generation of the evidence, they should also be part of the publication of it, because they own the evidence and they should also own the publication and the dissemination, I think. I'm from Novartis, and it has worked for us very well to do that. Where I have maybe a question to this group, because we are right now working on a specific project in Sweden, is rather around what is the concrete role of the patient community when it comes to the data generation? How can they be ideally involved in the data generation, so they are then also prepared for being author of any publication? Is it maybe they are helping to recruit patients to create evidence, or are there maybe other roles out there? And I see Trishna and other people who might have some good answers for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that. I mean, I think certainly from, you know, for authors, for patients to be involved as the author in a publication, journal editors, we always harp on about the ICMJE criteria, as Trishna mentioned, which are the sort of the criteria we use to judge whether somebody has sort of ticked all the boxes to act as an author on a paper. The easiest way for somebody to tick all those boxes, whether it's a patient or anybody else, is to be involved, you know, right the way through a study, you know, from the design of the trial to, you know, the whole process. If you've been involved in the generation of that data, then it just makes logical sense that you're involved then in the authoring of that publication. What we don't want is sort of people sort of parachuted in at the end just to tick a box because people want to have a patient author on their paper because they think it, you know, it looks good for whatever reason. You actually want genuine engagement, and the easiest way to do that is to engage right the way down the study pathway. But I'll stop talking if there's anyone else who wants to chime in on that. Any other people that perhaps have been involved in patient as a patient on these sorts of perhaps involved in a study. Carol, do you want to speak?
I just want to say that I would really like to hope that I wasn't just a tag on.
Absolutely not.
anything I've been involved with, but I mean, for me, if you're a patient, one of the best ways to actually get involved is to be involved with the likes of PFMD or UPATI or any of those kind of organisations, because they're the ones who are doing studies, they're the ones who are doing publications within the realm of what you're doing. Plus, you get to do it in an environment that you understand, because there's no point in joining a team for a publication when you haven't got a clue what they're talking about. And I think that's half the problem. I mean, for me right now, we're talking about patient engagement publications, but it goes way beyond that. I mean, you're talking about plain language summaries before, and I'm fortunate enough to be, and Trishna said before she jumped in and said that she does as well. plain language summaries, but it's not just about language. I mean, what you've got to understand is that patient engagement goes way beyond words on paper. It's about the format of those words. It's about what do they look like. It's about how do you put the stats on the paper. Are you doing infographics? Are you just, you know, putting simple drawings and everything like that? So even as patient reviewers of plain language summaries, you're going way more beyond just looking at what text is in comparison to what the research paper is telling you. Because I mean, yeah, I get to read a lot of interesting research papers in the process, and some of it I don't bloody understand because it's scientific, but you get the gist of it, you know, enough to understand whether or not the right part of it is being put into the plain language summaries. So when you're talking about patient engagement publications, you've also got to remember that those plain language summaries, they might not be about patient engagement themselves, but it is actually patient engagement as an entity.
Yeah.
I just thought I would just point that out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Krishna, I can see you've got your hand up as well. I'm just going to go, Diana has informed me we do have 2 more questions, 2 more slides to get through. So I'll ask Diana to pull that back up as well. And perhaps if you wanted to talk while she's doing that.
Yes, it was just in direct relation to Francisca, what Francisca was asking. So I think actually at Novartis, you're actually in a really good position because Novartis has actually got some really ambitious and what I would say really great objectives to have patients involved in the design of all clinical trial protocols. I can't remember the exact parameters, it's within a certain number of years. Well, if you're going to get patients involved in that, and there's been a number of presentations done about Novartis's patient engagement strategies at various conferences and stuff where this has been outlined. Well, if patients are involved in the design of the protocols, then they can be, then that in itself, they will be able to meet the ICMJE criteria because they were involved in the design of the study. And so those patients that you're involving in the design of the protocol, just don't forget about them, because yes, you know, it might be X number of years until the publication happens, but they meet authorship criteria. So make sure that you're still involving them throughout. So actually, I think in Francisca, in Novartis, you're already in a good position to be able to be involving more patients in the publications, because you're already getting that first criteria of ICMJE. You're already ticking that box.
Brilliant, thank you. And I can see people have been clicking on the poll as we've been going along. So the survey showed that some of the limitations to developing these kind of publications was a lack of internal resources and clear guidance on how to proceed. And it seems so far that 100% of people agree with that. So I guess, you know, whatever I think this is thinking perhaps possibly from internal resources within pharmaceutical companies, but I guess resources that are available to anybody and guidance on how to proceed is always going to be a barrier if you're getting involved in something that you've not done before. And as Carol mentioned, organisations like PFMD could be really valuable here. I think if we move to the 4th question.
Yeah, Lauren, I'm sorry to interrupt. Wafa from Jensen, I would also want to add that actually, you know, it's also kind of a mindset stuff. So it's not only the resources, but it's also that, to be honest, whether it's on, you know, patient engagement, you know, processes or methodology, or whether it's on, you know, project. I think that someone mentioned in the call before, you know, sharing insights from patients, or like what you uncovered, you know, on a disease is not like, basically we're not used to share. That's also it. I think that there's we're not the group that shares the most openly, and this is where we need to go better, especially when, I don't know, thinking about rare diseases, but also thinking, you know, about disease awareness information. This should not be considered competitive. So you should be able to publish your insights together with patients, and for it to be accessible to everyone. We've also discussed with the PFMD ad board that basically also sharing more about types or categories or successes or maybe failures of different patient engagement initiatives or processes would also help leveraging awareness between pharma companies. So it's not only lack of internal resources and clear guidance, it's also, you know, not the habit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand. It's sort of like a sort of a cultural shift, really, isn't it?
Exactly.
And I think especially what you're saying there about not just sharing the successes but the failures, that kind of isn't as commonly done. You know, negative studies are generally less published, and all those sorts of things. So yeah, but so valuable if we're all going to learn from each other's experiences. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for that. Diana, do we have a final polling question?
We have a regular question. So people
a regular question. Okay, so a final question. So what do we think is needed to help support the systematic development of patient engagement publications? So I think we've already spoken on that a little bit now, in terms of perhaps more resources, but also a mindset change. Are there any other thoughts from the group? And you know, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand again. Any other thoughts on what we need to help support these sorts of publications? I mean, I think possibly just going back to the point from Baber a little bit earlier, more broad awareness that these sorts of publications exist in a more diverse group would be useful. And I think possibly that's where patient advocacy organisations like PFMD can come to play. Trishna, you've got your hand up. Would you like to?
Yeah, just to kind of to sort of broaden on that point, I think there also needs to be a lot more awareness and education for patient organisations and patient advocates, just generally around the possibility of publications, because so in the projects that I've been involved in, often the idea of doing a publication about the patient engagement activities has often come from the patient advocates and the patient organisations themselves, because I don't know if that's because we have a vested interest in getting the word out there or what, but if it's being driven by us and others don't know about it, then the projects that they're involved in, the topic may never get raised. So I think just generally, you know, I mean, this is I think a brilliant start, because it's really encouraging awareness. It's letting people know that we can be publishing about patient engagement initiatives and activities, and I think furthering that awareness, so maybe talking about it at the conferences and having more and more people suggest a publication if they're involved in a patient engagement activity, I think will be really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think also Richie has stated something similar in the chat. So an understanding of what is of interest to stakeholders beyond groups like this. Obviously, if we're here, it's because we're passionate about patient engagement, but there's a lot of patients out there that this wouldn't be on their radar at all. So having an understanding of what's of interest to them is really, really important. Baber, you've got your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to add that probably it's not just about patients, it's also about the companies and the researchers that are in the country. In my country, it's it has taken me ages to make people understand that patient voice is important. And I have a feeling that if I was not so much engaged with my European and global organizations, I would be out of this bubble as well. And I would have never had the possibility to be co-author of some of the publications in the field. And I see that as a problem for other patient organizations in my country and patient advocates, because we are just doing other things. Advocacy and research is just a part of what patient organizations are doing. And here we are mostly focusing on various events and awareness raising. So totally different scope of activities that we are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments? Oh, I've got a comment in the chat here from Anne-Claire. Scroll back up again. So Anne-Claire says that leaders set the tone, so setting expectations for their teams in academia, research teams, agencies, pharma, etc. it's an expectation, it becomes the norm. Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that. And I think perhaps I'd add journals to that as well. I think sometimes journal editors can have quite a lot of influence, particularly over things like perhaps patient authors, making it an easy path for patients to fulfill authorship criteria, acting in a supportive manner that allows patients to take part in that authorship process, not putting up barriers, and pushing back if we are receiving publications that perhaps we think ought to have patient representation, but don't. Got another comment as well from Olivia, who agrees with Richie. Be great to have examples of stakeholders taking patient engagement publications seriously and considering patient engagement data in decisions. For example, the regulators like the FDA and the EMA. Yeah, absolutely. I think this would convince more scientists in the pharma industry of the importance of PE publications. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. There's some hearts and some thumbs up for that that comment in the chat as well. Yeah, when regulators, and I think there is some push from funding agencies, for example, that are trying to advocate for more patient involvement more generally in research, not thinking necessarily specifically about publications, but pushing for more patient involvement in research and sort of making that a part of funding requirements to make sure that patients are involved early in studies, and yeah, where funding goes, people generally follow. So we've just got a few more minutes left. Did anyone else have any comments about potential barriers, and I guess thinking positively what we could do to overcome some of those? Language, that's another good one. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, our focus is well, my focus, I work only on English language journals, so yeah, that tends to be where I work. But yeah, for things to be fully accessible, then language is such a massive barrier to a lot of people having access to this sort of, I mean, I think if you're reading other publications and have access to other resources, then perhaps you're more likely to know that these things exist, you're more likely to get involved yourself. But if they're not available in your own language, then that's a huge problem. Oh, I've got multiple comments in the chat now. Oh, I seem to have missed a couple, apparently. Let me go back up. Ah, yes, from Wafei. Yes, so it starts with early involvement of patients in projects, whether PE or clinical studies. Publications are then the natural path forward, with all authors fulfilling ICMJE criteria. Yes, absolutely agree. I think the earlier, the better, really, and the whole thing just becomes just the way things are done. And I think those are all the comments. So I think I mentioned Richie's before. Apologies, Richie, if I've missed a second comment from you. But yes, I think we just have another couple of minutes. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a whole other topic, but I was speaking at another session recently about AI and the possible pros and cons of that within publishing. One of the possible pros, I think, from AI is its use as possibly in translation of content into other languages. Obviously, there's a multitude of possible problems as well, but that's tools that make content more accessible in that way. And I think plain language summaries as well, not just translating into different languages, but translating more technical content into plain language. Could be.
I think there's been a journal article done about that, hasn't there, recently? Joe sent it to me the other day, but I've not had a chance to read it yet. About AI,
sent it to me as well.
Language translation.
Yeah, but I think accessibility is a huge issue, and perhaps AI might be one of the solutions. But I think we're coming up on time. Sean, are we about there?
Yes, I think so.
Perfect. So I think we will all ping back into the main plenary session in a second or two. So I don't think you need to click or do anything. You'll just find yourself back in the main room, and then we're going to have a bit of a summation, both of our own session, but what the other groups have been talking about as well. So it'll be interesting to see how closely we correlate with what they've been saying. But thank you all for your contributions, and I hope this has been useful. Thank you.
So we'll talk a little bit around who's in the room, what some of the motivators are, and what some of the barriers are based on the survey, and just really have a robust discussion to understand what everybody thinks is needed to more systematically support the development of patient engagement in publications. So with that, I think, Iffy, they have to click on the...
Yep, so pop your phones out, access the QR code, so you can join us for our live survey. We want to know about your stakeholder group. So open your QR code reader and log into Slido so that you can access the questions.
Thanks. I haven't quite figured out the QR codes.
That's okay. I get my son to help me.
Yeah. And so while we're waiting on the results, I can share a little bit around the survey results were that we had 51 respondents prior to the session. And it looks like there was the majority representation, about almost 70% are industry and then patient or patient organizations overall attending the session. So I'm curious to see how this breakout pans out and who's in the room. Oh, we got 100% industry. Okay, so switched from industry, largely industry representatives, to patients, and then a patient organization as well. It doesn't look like we have any healthcare professionals or med tech in the room. So that's good to know heading into the conversation. So I think we can move to the next slide. Pretty evenly split between patients and industry. So, okay, in the preliminary survey, we heard key motivators for developing patient engagement publications included demonstrating robustness of patient engagement methodology, providing accessible and citable documentation, giving feedback to stakeholders, and increasing visibility. So the question to address in Slido here is just yes or no. Do you agree with this, that the motivators for developing patient engagement publications are around the robustness of the methods, accessible documentation, giving feedback to stakeholders, and then also increasing visibility? So if you can go ahead and enter your responses there, it's just a simple yes or no, and then we'll take a look.
That's a resounding response, Lisa.
Yeah, I wasn't sure everybody's finished yet, but it probably, because I know I wholeheartedly agree with this, but
well,
yeah, that's pretty...
We have so far 10 out of 19 of our participants. So the other 9, please go ahead and give your response if you can. So yeah, it seems that we've kind of captured what the key motivators are.
Okay, that's great.
I noticed in the chat that there's also a link, and I think some people are finding it easier to vote via the link. So if that's you as well, finding it easier, then go ahead, access the chat, and get to Slido that way instead of the QR code.
Great. Yeah, I found for us at Johnson & Johnson that the robust methodology was huge at the end of the day. And we've, over the past couple of years, really enhanced our methodology, leveraging software for data analysis, which was something new that we implemented. How we sort of classify the work that we do with exploratory focus group, just getting that language down and developing a narrative has been really valuable to enable scientific publication overall for our research and patient engagement. So I definitely agree with this as well. Sort of cultivating some qualitative research expertise within J&J, so it's exciting. All right, so we are going to use the Q&A box to contribute, to dig into this a little bit deeper. What are your thoughts about the motivators, and are there any others from your stakeholder group perspective? So while everybody agreed, are there any other thoughts or maybe experiences that you've had that speak to some of these motivators? And you can use the chat function at the bottom. And then if you have a question, you can just raise your hand.
I think it'd be great. I see that we have 50% of participants in the room are from the patient stakeholder group. So it'd be great to hear from someone in that who represents that stakeholder group. What other motivators are there from the patient perspective I think I know we've captured many from sort of industry and other perspectives, but hearing the patient perspective would be really great. So be brave, raise your hand, pop it in the chat, and let's have a bit of a discussion around other motivators.
I can share too that, you know, when we work with our patients, not only the altruism in wanting to help others as a reason to be engaged and also be patient co-authors, but some of the work that we do, they feel like it's sort of a support group, if you will, too. They're engaging with patients in the same disease areas, and they get to know each other. And that's been sort of an unintended benefit, I think, too, for the patients as part of being involved in the patient engagement research process. I'm curious if there's any thoughts around that or any other perspectives here. And I see Rachel has her hand raised.
Hi. It's not really a question as such, but it's an observation. I think it's hard to engage patients as a patient organisation that we run, but when they do, we often find that patients are able to give a holistic perspective of their condition and willing to support other patients themselves, wanting to raise the awareness. But I think the clinicians, from our experiences, is very scientific in their approach of treating these conditions, and sometimes they can be blinkered into this one road, which actually a condition might have several different roads elements to it, where the patients are having to consider every single road. But in terms of treatment, then, you know, the clinicians will go down one road, and it's things like the mental health support, social care aspects, you know, all of those things should be included and represented. So it's great. It's a great way to be able to get patient engagement, to highlight these issues, but it's a huge strain on us as patient organisations, because 9 times out of 10 we're small, under-resourced, and trying to meet that need where healthcare systems don't. So yeah, it wasn't really a question, it was just an observation, really.
I think that's a great observation. Mental health is actually something that comes up in every conversation we have with patients, Rachel, across all disease areas. Even though we're talking around like treatment decision-making for, you know, multiple myeloma, it will be the mental health aspect and sort of the wraparound services that the patients always say are so critical. So I appreciate your comment and perspective.
And Dominique, can I ask you to contribute?
Oh, sure. I'm fine. Thank you for this conversation. This is really pinpoint. We're doing actually a capstone for our graduation, our grad program at U of T. And we're looking into ways to motivate patient engagement and how to share the value of their input in early stage health innovation discussions. And we're using brainstorming events or hackathons to kind of test our theory. We've noticed that one of the gaps is that there's a lot of patients, and there's elements of DEI, and patients don't really know the whole value of their contribution. So we're trying to find ways to market that value and to increase participation into like early stage discussions to really change or increase the success of the innovation product. So my question is, we're looking into means to publish our findings within the next 6 months, and how to go forward with this to make sure that we're really representing the patient voice, and we're having members of the patient community with PAN. So it's just trying to, this conversation is just pinpoint where we are in our project.
Have you inquired with a potential journal, perhaps, where you think the information would be relevant? I thought that was a really great tip from Laura. And we do that as well in industry. We'll reach out to the journal just to give them an overview and see if it's something that they think might be of interest, particularly when it's so patient focused, right? I think that's really key. I don't know if others actually have any thoughts on this as well.
I have one thought, and around sort of journal selection as well, is sometimes some journals will do a specific call for, or they're trying to build a group of papers, and they can sometimes be a really good starting point. Obviously, you have to do a bit of desk research to find the journals that might be interested, but I think that's a really good starting point. And Karen, I see you have your hand raised. If I could ask you to contribute.
Yes, can you hear me, Effie?
Yes, we hear you clearly. Thank you, Karen.
Perfect. Well, it's 1:30 in the morning in Australia, so I have to check that I'm speaking properly. I just popped a thing in the chat because I really liked what was being said in terms of industry, motivators and barriers, and thanks for organizing this seminar. It's been great. I popped something in the chat with a reference to some research we did and presented at the DIA a few years ago, where we looked for the first time at what CEOs and chairs were saying in their annual reports, which is probably the most important 2 pages issued by industry, given its breadth of dissemination. And the actual word patient was used less than 1% of the time of words used. When it was used, it was more patients as passive recipients. So this was for the top 10 global pharma. And I'm just wondering, we've got so many champions of PE on this call, what is happening with speaking with the C-suite in that critical 2-page of their annual report each year, talking about patient partnerships and moving away from this sort of patriarchal, passive view. I just think that would be a motivator, and could certainly room for improvement. It's highly transparent, highly measurable. Annual reports are promoted far and wide, and I think that could help change. It's really getting leadership from the C-suite and the board, though. How can that happen?
Karen, I love that comment. It's something we're trying to do I'm trying to do in my patient engagement world. At J&J, we have our annual transparency report that talks about, patient access to our products and the work that we've really driven there as an organization, which is fabulous. But I think it could really be bolstered by including patient quotes, patient sentiments to really bring it home and humanize the data. I think it's there's lots of layers in industry, and just trying to wade through that, but feeling very passionately and finding those champions in the business to keep elevating the work that you're doing is so critical. Sometimes it's a lot of work some days, but it's important work that we do, right? And I recognize that, but I feel very passionately, and I think we're going to get there, where there's that world where patients truly are, their perspectives are embedded into everything we do. You just have to have the people committed to do it within the organizations, I believe. But I'm going to take a look at that report, Karen. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Well, keep going. Knock on that CEO's door, Lisa. They'll be hearing what you're doing. So good luck with that. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
And I'm afraid, as the timekeeper, I know there were a couple of raised hands and other questions. Please put it in the chat. And we'll try and get round to them. But in the meantime, I think we need to move on to the next slide, please.
Okay, so this one's about the limitations to developing patient engagement publications. So the survey, we heard that the limitations were lack of internal resources and lack of guidance on how to proceed. So the question here for Slido is, do you agree? And it's a yes or no response. 100% agree. Does it look, oh, there we have a no outlier. It's good. I'd love to hear any comments on this response. I think resourcing is always a challenge. I know it is for industry. Do we have time to take a comment here, Iffy, for anyone who said no and would like to speak up, or even put it in the chat?
Yeah, let's pop it in the chat, please. And I should just I just want to pointing out that from our preliminary survey, we had 35 respondents citing lack of budget and limitation in internal resources, and 22% citing lack of clear guidance. So overall, those two points made up more than half of the reasons for having limitations. So it'll be great to move to the next part of the session where we start talking about, well, what do we need? And Barbara, I love your comment around probably lack of planning. I 100% agree. 100% agree. I hope we can talk a bit more about that in the next session. Over to you, Lisa.
Yeah. So so let's use the Q&A box around what you think is needed to support systematic development. Sorry, is it the chat function? That we'll just continue using the chat to respond to this question. And feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or just even comment that you want to verbalize. That's great. While people are thinking about this, Barbara, I also appreciate your comment around lack of planning, because we've spent some time over the past couple of years to make sure that the capabilities that we've built around engaging patients, that we are embedded in the annual business planning process, right? Because we need to make sure we're resourcing that annually for those continuous perspectives. So getting embedded into the business planning process was really important. And then also staying embedded is also something to think about. And planning, as well as funding for this type of research, it's also then planning for publication at the same time, right? So asking the question, okay, are you going to be funding a long-term panel next year? With that, do you also want to seek publication? Having those questions and that dialogue with the therapeutic areas is really, really critical. I lead a team of 2, and I often, they're the ones embedded with the therapeutic areas. And around this time, actually the past couple of months, is our business planning. And it's very much, let's stay in front of them. Let's make sure that we, continue to engage with patients and that there's that resourcing available for that. And a lot of that is also then sharing use cases, the value, the impact, and building up those stories to share with the organization for continued funding.
And I see a question in the chat from Sally. Sally, do you want to explain that question to us?
Hi everyone. So it was just a clarification question really, because I was just thinking about the way in which the question was written on the screen. And when we talk about patient engagement publications, are we talking about us publishing on patient engagement, so almost around patient engagement practices and quality improvement and that sort of thing? Or are we just talking about publications where around working and partnering with patients and carers in the work that's happening? It was more of because I think they're 2 quite different things.
I think our approach is very much broad-based. So anything where you are talking about engaging with patients, patient engagement activities, either the methodology, the insights from patients, the outputs, anything like that, where you can publish it and put it into a peer-reviewed publication that is documented, citable, findable. That's what we're talking about. So quite broadly. So thank you for that question, Sally.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's also a really great comment from Trudy too, a section about how they were engaged to prevent tokenism, and completely agree. When we've published, we have methodology that talks about the patient input, how we've recruited, how we've engaged, what the focus group sort of cadence was like, how the data was analyzed. We make sure we acknowledge the patient partners in the acknowledgement section, and then 50% of our publications right now have patients as co-authors, and we're starting to get to the point where every paper we challenge the team, like we should be including a patient as a co-author on this as well. So wanted to share that, but I appreciated that comment.
Can I just ask a quick question based on the co-authorship that you've just mentioned? How are you managing to measure that across the organization?
By measure, what do you mean? Sorry.
So you by the way, that's really impressive that 50% of publications are including patient co-authorship. I'm just
In
trying
my,
to
let me clarify, actually, though, it's just our patient engagement research that we do. So we have about 20 active publications in our portfolio right now. So for patient engagement research that we do, the patient insight generation is 50% that for that, not everything at J&J. That is an important distinction.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
That's and do you so I think it was a question or a comment in the chat. I don't know if it was in the earlier part of the meeting where somebody was mentioning in the chat about when patients are co-authors, that to make sure that the similar terminology is used around patient author, so that when we're searching on publications and things, then we can get an accurate understanding of that co-authorship, because I think it can be really challenging if there's not systematic reporting in the literature. So I just wondered whether you did something like that within the organisation as well, have some systematic approach to how that co-authorship is outlined in the manuscript.
Often, well, actually what we've mirrored the processes for engaging key opinion leaders and healthcare providers as co-authors on our papers and abstracts posters. So they have to meet ICMJE guideline. They're involved in the kickoff calls. They're part of developing the narrative. They're part of revising the manuscript. We very much follow the ICMJE guidelines, which is also what we do for KOLs. So that's sort of a nice specific example that I shared earlier around leveraging existing guardrails and processes in place and then applying them to the patient space. So do we want to kind of talk a little bit around what you think is needed to support systematic development? Or any other thoughts on some of the comments made? There's a lot of expertise in the room too. Happy to hear what others are doing.
Yeah, that would be great, Lisa. Does anyone have anything to add or comment around if 86% agreed that some kind of guidance potentially would be important? What kind of guidance? Guidance on what? Any sort of specifics here that we want to mention?
So in the survey, when people mentioned about guidance, was there specifics around the type of guidance that people needed, or did it not go into that much detail?
It didn't go into that much detail. So any sort of feedback here? And I see Trudy, you have your hand up. Let's have a discussion with Trudy, please.
So something as simple as how to fill out the conflict of interest forms that you have to fill out when you're part of co-authoring, and any of the forms that you have to fill out. Sometimes they're intended for researchers and they're pretty complicated for patient partners. I often have to go back and forth with the researcher to say, how am I supposed to answer this question? How do I fit in here? Because the research journals aren't really intended. They should almost have a section for patient co-authors and for researchers. So, and before, when I mentioned about tokenism, I'm often co-author on an article, a research study, but nothing's really mentioned in the study other than we use patient partners. So I think that's something that really needs to change, even as a co-author.
Any other comments or discussion points around this and what is actually needed? Because I think we're almost ready to come out of our breakout and join the rest of the plenary. But I think we have a minute or so for any other additional comments.
I think that was a nice comment, Trudy, just around making sure that some of the materials and forms are patient friendly too, right? And sort of catering the process to enable patients as partners in publications. So I think that's a good takeaway, Iffy, and I'm taking notes for the comment. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I see, Rachel, your comment in there around trust, particularly when pharmaceutical companies trusted. Karen had a comment in there around asking editors to stop requiring patient authors to have an institutional affiliation.
Yeah, I remember ISMAP this year, someone pointing out that questions like having to have sort of an academic background or having to put in your kind of faculty or, you know, whether you've got your PhD, BSc, all those things. And they got around it by having a designation that was DEX or like designated patient expert or something. And that was their kind of degree, as it were, or title. So they got around it that way. So yeah, there are some logistical and practical elements that have to be considered as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are at time, and I think it's probably time to enter the go back to plenary. I see lots of additional comments in the chat. Thank you so much for adding those in. We'll be considering all of those because we're saving it all up so that we can reflect on this at our leisure. But meantime, let's go back to the plenary.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your comments and thoughts, questions.
We now have just a couple of minutes to give some feedback from each of the breakout rooms. We'll start with group one, please, Dawn.
Okay, thanks to everyone in group one. So in terms of motivators, a couple of other things that we chatted about is that we want to be able to answer the questions that the community wants answering, not having these simply be driven by industry or researchers as perceived needs for communities, and having communities really take ownership of these questions and answers. And then we talked about the fact that citability, that peer review is a gold standard, and it, you know, having things published addresses doubt around this kind of data and this kind of data being seen as robust, which I kind of liken to the point that I spoke to about how patients are seen as very subjective, biased, et cetera, until they're part of one of these robust processes. So the same goes for patient engagement. In terms of limitations, we saw that mirroring the original survey for the pre-work for prior to the webinar, we had about 60% of folks agree with limitations. Now we had a great discussion about those. About 30% weren't sure, and we had some individuals not agreeing. And again, those are all part of the discussion notes that came from our group. So thanks everyone for all of your input. I really appreciated working with you.
Hi, everyone. Yes, thanks, Dawn. Really interesting, I think, to see how all our different groups compare. So in our room, some of the motivators that we talked about were demonstrating the value of patient engagement. I think it was Trishna who said that we always have to justify our involvement as patients. So if we have the evidence, then we can demonstrate its value. Also, if patients contribute to the generation of the data via clinical trials, they should be involved as authors on the papers. And that's another motivator. Also, that patients can contribute to the design of a clinical trial protocol, and therefore they meet the ICMJE criteria for authorship. So not so much a motivator is really a rule that they should be being included and not excluded from authorship. And then a final motivator that we discussed is that the patient voice is important, and spreading the good word to patient advocacy groups and patients via peer-reviewed publications is a really valuable motivator. As you can see from the right-hand side of this slide, our limitations were 100% agreed on, but when we dove into the discussion section, we also had various other limitations in addition to those mentioned there that we discussed that were really interesting. So things like there needing to be not only internal resources available, but also mindset changes within pharma about sharing this kind of information, sharing the failures as well as the successes, and also limitations sort of for global involvement, so perhaps from smaller countries or from rare diseases and things like that. So some other interesting limitations that we discussed. Yeah, really great session. Thank you for everyone who contributed.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I'm going to ask Lisa to give feedback from her room in the next slide.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, John. So the motivators that our group discussed was they did agree overall with the motivators identified in the pre-PEOF survey there. Leadership is key for motivation, so making sure you have support from senior leaders, also for uptake, as well as resourcing patient engagement activities and publications. So we talked a little bit around making sure that senior leaders have visibility to the impact of the work that you're doing and the value that it brings. One additional motivator identified in our session would be if a patient expert is developing themselves in research and academia. So we did talk a little bit around how there's a need for sort of more patient-friendly language when it comes to the authorship process, and that the authorship process does kind of skew towards someone who might be more educated or have experience publication like a PhD. How can we kind of make it so it's accessible to all patients, which I thought was a really great point. On the right-hand side there is limitations. And so overall that our group agreed that the limitations were lack of internal resources and clear guidance. And then there was just, I guess, probably one no and one don't know, but overall aligned with the limitations that were identified in the pre-work survey. So thank you to my breakout group and Iffy for a really nice discussion as well.
That's great. Thank you, all our panelists for their wrap up. And I'll ask Anne-Marie just to talk about next steps in the last minute.
I will go very fast. So rich discussions today around needs and support for the development of PE publication. Of course, a lot to distill, to identify key themes across the 3 workshops group today. So our next steps, first, we plan to share the PEOF session insight with the PE Publication Advisory Board. We will co-create action list of needs and priorities and collaborate with the PE community to co-develop solutions. So don't forget that this session has been recorded, and a link to the session recording and resource can be accessed through signups. Next slide. Okay, if you want to find out more, know more, or wish to contribute to the next step, which is very important, please email myself or Iffy at Twist. And it's time to thank all the participants. I think we had very rich discussions today. So thank you for all your insights. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank our speakers who have been highly motivated from the beginning of all this journey when we invited them to join the speakers panel. And of course, the PFMD team who supported us with the organization of this PEOF session. It's time to close and to say thank you and goodbye.